Forbidden Love, Deadly Secrets. Young woman's dangerous affair with a married man in Dubai. True crime. Hook. What happens when a young woman's forbidden love spirals into a deadly game of cat and mouse? A dangerous secret, a powerful man, and a life-changing decision. Stay tuned to discover how she fights to escape her past, and what happens when the truth finally catches up with her. The sun dipped low over the skyline of Dubai, casting long shadows across the shimmering city. Lila stood on the balcony, gazing out at the vast expanse. The air was warm, but the evening breeze felt oddly cold against her skin. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from him. She quickly unlocked it. Meet me tonight. Same place. 11 p.m. Her heart skipped. A forbidden meeting. She could feel the weight of it pressing on her chest. The city seemed to hum around her, its lights flickering like 1,000 secret whispers. But this secret, it was different. She was in love with a married man, and he had promised her it would be forever. Lila didn't know what was more terrifying, her emotions or the consequences. The hours dragged on. She couldn't stop thinking about his words. Meet me tonight. She pulled herself together. The door clicked shut behind her as she left the apartment. The elevator ride down felt like an eternity. Her pulse quickened as the car slid into the underground parking lot. The dim lighting made the shadows look deeper, darker. A sharp click echoed as she exited the car, walking toward the alley. A soft shuffle of footsteps behind her. It was him. She felt a shiver race down her spine. His eyes were dark, full of promise, but there was something off about him tonight. He looked over his shoulder, a glint of fear flickering in his gaze. The alley was empty, silent, except for the soft sound of their breath. Lila leaned in. His lips brushed against her ear, whispering, "It's not safe here. They're watching." Her stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" she whispered. His wife, she found out. Her blood ran cold. The hairs on her neck stood straight. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed from the shadows. Lila froze. Something or someone was coming. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned to run, but her legs felt heavy. Her heart pounded. Then she saw it. A figure, dark and tall, stepping from the shadows. And the last thing Lila felt, before everything went black, was a sharp pain. A breathless silence followed. The world was spinning when Lila woke. Her vision blurred. The air smelled stale, like mildew and dust. Her head throbbed. She tried to move, but her arms were bound. The cool metal of the chair dug into her skin. Panic surged as her mind began to clear. Where was she? What had happened? The shadows loomed around her, stretching across the cold, concrete floor. A faint hum of machinery in the distance. She heard footsteps, slow and deliberate. Her throat felt dry. Her mouth was like sandpaper. The door creaked open. Lila's pulse raced. A figure stepped into view. It was him, but his face was different now. The softness, the warmth gone. His eyes were empty. "Why?" she managed to whisper, her voice shaking. He stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "I didn't want this," he murmured, his voice hollow. "You didn't want what?" she gasped. The truth hit her like a slap. His wife had found them, and now they were both trapped. Lila could barely process the fear rising within her. The sound of footsteps came again, this time from behind. A woman's voice, sharp and cold. "Did you really think you could escape?" The door slammed open, revealing a tall, imposing figure. It was her, the wife. Her gaze burned with anger. Lila's heart skipped a beat. She tried to speak, but her throat was tight. The woman stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "You've ruined everything," she hissed. Lila could barely breathe as the tension in the room thickened. The man stood there, frozen, The wife's eyes never left Lila, and then the truth sank in. There would be no escape. Not for any of them. The air was suffocating now, each breath harder to take. The wife leaned down, a twisted smile forming on her lips. "You'll regret this," she whispered, her voice low. The room seemed to close in. Lila's heart raced. And then everything went black once more when Lila woke again. The darkness seemed deeper. Her head ached, but it wasn't just the pain. The silence was deafening. She could hear her own breath, ragged and shallow, as if it were the only sound in the world. Her arms were still bound, but now the ropes felt tighter, cutting into her skin. She tried to shift, but a heavy weight pressed down on her chest. The faintest sound reached her ears, the scrape of a chair leg against the floor. Her heart jolted. She wasn't alone. "Stop, please," she whispered, her voice barely a murmur. The shadows in the corner shifted, and the air grew colder. Then she saw him, his face barely illuminated by the dim light. He was sitting across from her, his hands clasped together. His eyes seemed distant, lost. "Why are you doing this?" Lila's voice cracked. "I didn't want this," he replied, his voice flat, emotionless. Lila could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. "What did you think was going to happen?" she whispered through clenched teeth. He didn't answer. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. The wife, she had to be somewhere. Lila could feel the weight of her presence. Her eyes darted around the dark room, trying to find something, anything, to cut her bonds. But there was nothing. Then, the door creaked open again. The wife entered. This time, her movements were slow, deliberate. Lila could feel her eyes on her, cold, calculating. She didn't speak, but her eyes, they said everything. "You're nothing more than a pawn," the wife said finally, her voice low and menacing. Lila flinched. The woman stepped closer, her presence like a storm cloud. "You thought you could have him? Thought you could win," she hissed. Lila didn't answer. Her stomach churned. The wife raised her hand, and a glint of metal caught the dim light. A knife. Her pulse raced, and every breath felt like a battle. Lila's body tensed. "You're going to pay for this," the wife said, the knife catching the light again. Lila's breath caught in her throat. The final moment felt like an eternity. Her world shrank to the cold blade, moving closer. And then, everything was swallowed by darkness again, that Lila's eyes fluttered open once more. The darkness was gone, replaced by a sharp, blinding light. She could barely make sense of her surroundings. Her head throbbed. Every nerve screamed in pain. Her body was stiff, her limbs heavy. But there was no pain from the knife. Her chest tightened as she tried to focus, to remember what had happened. The last thing she could recall was the cold steel in the wife's hand, the glint in her eyes. But now there was only silence. A soft, rhythmic sound filled the air. Beeping. Lila's heart sank. A hospital? She blinked, her vision clearing slowly. The white walls around her seemed sterile, suffocating. And there, sitting in a chair beside her, was the man. His face was pale, drawn, his eyes tired, haunted. "You're awake," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Lila's throat felt raw as she tried to speak, but her words caught. She couldn't form a sentence. "What happened?" she croaked, her voice shaking. His hands trembled as he took a deep breath. "The wife, he stopped, swallowing hard. "Where is she?" Lila whispered, panic rising. She's gone," he said quietly, his voice strained. Lila's heart thudded painfully in her chest. "What do you mean gone?" His eyes darted away, avoiding her gaze. "She's dead," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Lila's stomach twisted, but she couldn't process it, couldn't make sense of his words. "She came after you. But things went wrong." His voice trailed off. Lila felt a chill crawl down her spine. Her mind raced to make sense of the situation. The woman, the wife, was dead. Had it been an accident? Had he? But the look in his eyes told her everything. This wasn't an accident. He had done it. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Lila couldn't breathe. The man's expression was full of regret, guilt, and something darker. Something Lila couldn't place. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "I never wanted this to happen, but she forced my hand." Lila's breath hitched. His confession hung in the air like a thick fog, but there was no time to process it. Because as his words faded, Lila realized the truth. Her world had shattered beyond repair, and there would be no escaping the consequences of what had unfolded. Not for any of them. Lila's mind raced, her thoughts colliding in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. He had killed her. And for what? To protect their twisted secret? Her hands clenched the bedsheets, her knuckles white. "I need to leave," Lila whispered, her voice trembling with panic. The man reached out, his hand shaking, desperate to stop her. "No, you can't leave. Not now." His voice was pleading, almost broken. Lila pulled back from him, her heart hammering in her chest. "You don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice low but sharp. "She's dead. Because of you." His face twisted with pain, but there was something else lurking in his eyes. Fear. Lila stared at him, her mind finally clearing through the fog of shock. "Where did they take her body?" she demanded, her voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. He hesitated, his lips trembling as he looked at the floor. They took her away," he said softly. I'm not sure where. I just wanted to protect you." Lila's eyes burned, and her breath grew ragged. "You wanted to protect me," she spat. "By killing her? By dragging me into your mess?" He looked like a man who was already lost, but there was no turning back, no undoing what had been done. "Lila, please," his voice cracked. "I did it for us. I didn't think she would go that far. I never wanted this to happen." Her body was trembling now, the weight of the situation suffocating. "Why?" she whispered, barely able to understand him. "Why would you do this?" His voice dropped to a whisper, his words sharp with regret. "Because I couldn't lose you." Lila recoiled from his touch, her body trembling with fear. "You never should have had me in the first place," she muttered, her heart racing. "I never should have let you in," he said, his eyes empty and hollow. "But there's something else in them now." Desperation. She knew in that moment there would be no more pretending, no more hiding. They were both trapped in this nightmare now. There was no way out. The room felt colder, the walls pressing in on her. Lila couldn't breathe, her mind spinning in a blur of panic and confusion. She tried to focus, but the weight of everything, the betrayal, the death, the lies, was too much. Her hands were shaking as she pushed herself up in the bed, wincing at the sharp pain in her chest. "I need to get out of here," she gasped, her voice tight with fear. The man stood, his face pale, eyes wide with panic. "You don't understand," he pleaded. "If you leave, they'll come for you." Lila froze. The words hung in the air like a threat, suffocating her. She whispered. His gaze darkened, and for the first time, she saw real fear in his eyes. "The authorities. The police. They'll know everything," he stammered. "They'll find you." Lila's blood ran cold. She had been so focused on the immediate horror of what had happened, on the knife, on the death, that she hadn't thought about the bigger consequences. She hadn't thought about what was coming next. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would they come after me?" His eyes locked with hers, dark and filled with something she couldn't place. "You're tied to this now. You're involved. Whether you want to be or not." Lila's heart dropped. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it. She hadn't killed anyone. She hadn't even touched the knife. But his words kept echoing in her mind. "You're involved. You need to stay quiet," he whispered urgently. "If you talk to anyone, if you tell anyone what happened, they'll come after both of us." Lila's stomach churned. She had no choice. No way out. She was trapped in his nightmare now. And the worst part was she didn't know who to trust. Her hands gripped the sheets again, her body trembling. The fear was suffocating. "I can't stay here," she said hoarsely, standing up despite the ache in her body. But as she moved toward the door, she heard it. A sound outside the room. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat. They were here. Her heart thundered in her chest as the door handle rattled. The man's eyes widened in terror. No, this can't be happening," he muttered under his breath. Lila spun toward him, her pulse racing. "This is it," he whispered, backing away from her. "They've come." The door creaked open, and Lila's world shattered once more. The door swung open with a creak, and the light from the hallway flooded the room. Lila froze, her heart pounding in her throat. Two figures stood in the doorway. Police officers. Their eyes scanned the room, narrowing when they saw her. She felt the weight of their gaze like a physical pressure on her chest. She wanted to speak, to explain, but no words came. Her throat felt tight, suffocating. The man beside her, his eyes were wide with fear. He tried to take a step forward, but the officers were already moving toward him. "Don't move," one of them said, his voice calm, but cold. "Stay where you are." Lila's mind raced. What now? What had happened while she'd been unconscious? Had they already figured out what had happened with the wife? Her thoughts were a blur, and her legs felt like lead. She tried to back away, but the officer's eyes flicked to her, and then his hand shot out to stop her. "Stay still," he commanded. The other officer moved past them, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of a struggle. Lila's pulse quickened as the officer's gaze settled on the bed, the sheets, the small puddle of blood at the edge of the mattress, and the silence in the air, thick with the weight of impending danger. He stepped toward her, his face expressionless. "Are you Lila?" he asked, his voice low. Lila didn't know how to respond. Her mouth was dry, her heart racing so fast she thought it might explode. The man beside her, his face drained of color, remained frozen. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice cracking. The officer didn't move, didn't blink. He was studying her every reaction. "Do you know why we're here?" he asked. Lila's mind was spinning. She couldn't say the truth. She couldn't even begin to explain. She shook her head, but it didn't matter. The officer stepped closer, his expression turning darker. "You're a witness to a murder." Lila's breath caught in her throat. A murder? Her head swam. A violent, overwhelming thought crashed into her. The wife. The man standing next to her. The truth she'd tried to avoid was now crashing into her, and there was no turning back. The officer's voice cut through the fog in her mind. "We know what happened," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "And we need you to come with us." Lila felt like the floor was falling out from under her. She had no choice, no way to escape the mess she was trapped in. The truth was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. Lila's legs trembled as she stood, unable to move, her entire body frozen in place. The officer's words echoed in her mind like a drumbeat. "You're a witness to a murder." She looked over at the man, his eyes full of desperation, pleading silently with her. But there was no way out. Not anymore. The second officer moved in front of her, his expression hard and unyielding. "Come with us," he repeated. The door behind them was wide open, the harsh light from the hallway spilling into the room like a warning. Lila couldn't breathe. She wanted to scream, to tell them everything, the truth of what had happened, how it had spiraled out of control. But she didn't even know where to start. Her hand instinctively reached out, touching the man's arm, seeking something, anything, that could ground her. But he recoiled, his face a mask of guilt and fear. The officer at the door stepped forward, his voice even colder now. "You're coming with us." Now, Lila's body moved on autopilot, following the officer's instructions, her mind numb. They led her down the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallways, each step feeling like it was taking her further away from everything she had known. The man remained behind her, but she could feel his presence like a dark shadow. She couldn't escape it, not when his secrets were now hers as well. They reached the elevator, and she stepped inside, the doors sliding shut with a soft chime. The silence in the small space was suffocating, broken only by the sound of her breath, ragged and uneven. The officer beside her didn't speak, and neither did the man. Lila could feel his eyes on her, but she didn't dare look at him. The guilt in his stare was unbearable. The elevator stopped with a soft jolt, and the doors opened to a stark, sterile hallway. Another officer stood at the entrance to an interrogation room waiting. Lila's pulse quickened. The questions were coming. The answers, the truth. Everything would spill out now, and there's no way to stop it. The officer gestured for her to enter, and she took a hesitant step inside, the door slamming shut behind her with a finality that made her stomach lurch. She was alone now, alone with the truth. And the consequences. The room was cold, the walls painted a dull gray that seemed to absorb every bit of light. A single overhead bulb flickered faintly, casting eerie shadows across the metal table in the center. Lila sat down on the hard chair, the seat creaking under her weight. The officer who had guided her in didn't leave. He remained standing by the door, his eyes sharp and unwavering. There was no escape, no exit. Lila felt the pressure build, her chest tightening with every second that passed. She couldn't focus. Her thoughts were scattered, drowning in a sea of confusion and fear. How had everything gone so wrong? The door opened again, and another officer entered, a woman this time. She was tall, with dark eyes that seemed to pierce through Lila as she walked toward the table. "Miss Lila," the officer said, her voice smooth but sharp. "I'm Detective Ramirez. I need you to tell me what happened." Lila swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust. The words felt stuck, lodged in her chest. Her mind raced. She couldn't trust anyone. Could she? Detective Ramirez sat across from her, folding her arms over her chest. Her gaze never wavered, and the silence stretched on between them. Finally, Lila spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say." The detective leaned in slightly, her voice dropping. "Start from the beginning, Miss Lila. You don't have to make this harder on yourself." The man, the one who had dragged her into this nightmare, flashed into her mind, his face, his empty eyes. But she couldn't say anything, not yet. The consequences were too severe. Lila closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I met him," she started, her voice trembling. "I didn't know he was married. It wasn't supposed to happen, but it did." Detective Ramirez's eyes flickered, a small nod of understanding. "Keep going." Lila felt her stomach twist. His wife, she found out. She confronted me. I didn't. She paused, her breath catching as the memory resurfaced. The woman's cold eyes, the knife flashing in the dim light. A sharp pain shot through her chest as the memory pressed in, suffocating her. The detective's voice cut through the fog. What happened after that? Lila's hands shook as she placed them on the table, trying to steady herself. I didn't want any of this. I didn't know what to do." The detective's gaze hardened. "Miss Lila, we have evidence. Your fingerprints are on the knife." Lila's blood turned to ice. The knife. Her breath hitched, panic rising as the truth started to sink in. She didn't remember. She didn't remember touching the knife, but the evidence was there, and she was caught in a web She couldn't escape. Lila's mind raced. How could she explain this? What would happen to her now? The officer's voice cut through her thoughts. Do you really think we don't know what happened? The truth always comes out, Miss Lila. The walls felt like they were closing in again, the air thick with dread. Her heart hammered in her chest. She was trapped, and she had no way out. Lila's pulse throbbed in her ears, the world outside the small interrogation room feeling distant and unreal. The weight of the detective's words hung heavy in the air, suffocating her with each passing second. The truth always comes out. Lila closed her eyes, but the images came rushing back. His wife, the confrontation, the chaos, the blurred line between what had happened and what she could remember, her mind refusing to piece it together. I didn't do it, she whispered, though even to her own ears, her voice sounded weak, uncertain. Detective Ramirez didn't flinch. Her eyes, dark and unwavering, locked onto Lila with a piercing intensity. Your fingerprints are on the weapon, Miss Lila, and we have a witness who saw you leave the scene. A witness. Lila's stomach turned. She wanted to scream, to deny everything, but the truth felt like a fog she couldn't break through. I didn't kill her. I didn't. Her voice cracked with desperation. The detective stood up and paced slowly around the table. She didn't speak, just observed, like a predator circling its prey. Lila shifted in her seat, her mind racing. She knew she wasn't getting out of this easily. There was no more pretending, no more lies. But if she wasn't the one who had done it, then who? And why was she the one sitting here, caught in this mess? Then tell me, Miss Lila. Ramirez's voice was smooth, calculated. How did your fingerprints end up on the knife? Lila shook her head, confusion clouding her thoughts. She couldn't remember. It was all a haze, her mind cloudy from fear, from the shock of everything that had happened. I don't remember. I don't know, she stammered. The detective stopped pacing, her gaze still steady, almost clinical. We've all seen this before. The shock, the denial. But it won't help you now. Lila's breath hitched, and she instinctively looked toward the door. The oppressive silence in the room felt heavier than ever. I didn't kill her, Lila said, her voice rising, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She was on the edge of breaking. Then why don't you remember? Ramirez asked, her tone dropping to something softer, but still sharp. Lila's eyes darted to the man who had brought her here, who had lied to her, who had pulled her into this nightmare. He was silent in the corner, his face unreadable. She had trusted him. But now, she wasn't so sure. The detective's gaze never left her. You're a suspect, Miss Lila. You've been caught in something much darker than you realize, Ramirez said softly, but the weight of her words seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Lila's mind was reeling, the edges of her thoughts blurring as the reality of the situation pressed in. Then the door behind her opened again, and a cold rush of air swept into the room. Another officer stepped inside, holding a small folder. The detective didn't even glance up. What is it? She asked, her voice low. The officer handed her the folder, and Ramirez began flipping through it, her expression unreadable. Lila's stomach twisted. What was happening? She couldn't stand the silence. Not anymore. What's in there? She asked, her voice shaking. Detective Ramirez didn't answer immediately. She continued flipping through the papers with cold precision. Then she stopped, her finger landing on one page, her eyes narrowing as she studied it. Lila's heart skipped a beat. Lila, Ramirez said slowly, her voice taking on a different tone now. We have a confession. Lila's chest tightened. A confession? Whose? The officer at the door stepped forward, his face grim. We found it hidden in his apartment. It's his. Lila turned, her head spinning. She looked at the man, his face suddenly paling as the truth hung in the air. And as the detective turned the page, revealing the damning words written in his own hand, Lila realized with shock. She wasn't the only one trapped. The real killer was still right there in the room with her. Lila's stomach twisted into knots as she stared at the man across the room. The words on the page, his confession, burned into her mind. It was undeniable. He had written it himself. The detective placed the page on the table, pushing it toward Lila. "Here," Ramirez said, her voice quiet but firm. "Read it." Lila hesitated, her hands trembling as she reached for the paper. Her heart hammered in her chest as she glanced at the neatly scrawled handwriting. It was almost too much to process, the reality of the moment crashing over her in waves. The confession was clear, too clear. Asterisk, I did it. I killed her, but I had to. I couldn't let her ruin everything. I couldn't lose Lila. She was the only thing that mattered to me, asterisk. Lila's eyes blurred as she read the words over and over again. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. "You," Lila whispered, her voice shaking with a mix of disbelief and betrayal. "You killed her." The man didn't look at her. His face was a mask of guilt, his hands shaking as he stood there, like a man awaiting his sentence. He said nothing, but his silence was all the answer Lila needed. Lila felt a coldness inside her, an emptiness that spread from her chest to her limbs. She could hardly breathe. He had done it. He had killed his wife to keep her from exposing their secret, because he was afraid of losing her. But what terrified Lila the most wasn't the fact that he had done it. It was the realization that she had been nothing more than a pawn in his twisted game. She had trusted him. She had believed in him. But now, she saw him for what he truly was, a man willing to do anything to protect himself and her. Detective Ramirez's voice broke through the fog in Lila's mind. "We found this at his apartment, along with other evidence." She paused, glancing at the man. "It's all here, Miss Lila." He thought he could get away with it. Lila didn't speak. She couldn't. Her thoughts were too scattered, too shattered to form any coherent response. The detective turned to the officer standing by the door, giving him a nod. "Take him into custody." The man didn't resist, didn't even flinch. He just looked at Lila once more, his eyes full of regret, but still cold. It was as if the weight of everything had finally crushed him, and he couldn't bear to meet her gaze any longer. As the officer led him out of the room, Lila remained still, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her mind numb. She hadn't even noticed the tears that had begun to fall down her face until she felt them on her cheeks, hot and steady. The world outside the room felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. Detective Ramirez didn't leave right away. She watched Lila silently for a moment, then spoke, her voice softer now. "You're not the killer, Lila. You're just caught in the middle of something far bigger than you realize." Lila didn't respond. She couldn't. The weight of everything, the lies, the betrayal, the murder, was too much to bear. In that moment, she didn't know what was worse. The truth that she had almost been an accomplice to a crime she hadn't committed, or the fact that she had trusted the wrong person, and it had nearly cost her everything. The detective's footsteps echoed in the hallway outside as she left the room, but the silence that followed was deafening. Lila sat there, alone, the confession still burning in her mind. Her world had shattered, and there was no telling if she could ever put the pieces back together again. Lila sat there in the suffocating silence, the cold metal chair pressing into her back, her hands still trembling. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the lies, the violence, had yet to fully sink in. She felt numb, as if the world had slowed down, everything happening around her just out of reach. She hadn't asked for any of this. She had never imagined that her life would be torn apart by a man who had whispered sweet promises, only to turn out to be a killer, a man capable of taking a life to hold on to his own twisted version of love. Lila looked down at her hands, her fingers curled tightly around the edges of the table, her nails digging into the wood. The confession, the cold words of the detective, it all echoed in her mind, each piece of the puzzle snapping into place, whether she wanted it to or not. She could feel the sting of betrayal in her chest, the sharp ache of knowing that she had been a part of something unspeakable, even if she hadn't killed anyone herself. Her thoughts spun in circles, searching for some clarity, some way out of this. The door opened again, and Lila didn't even look up. But then, a voice she hadn't expected broke through the haze of her mind. "Lila." She looked up, and there he was. The last person she ever thought she'd see. A man with a face she once trusted, now tainted by everything he had done. The detective, Ramirez. The sharp, hardened gaze was softer now, her expression more empathetic. She didn't have the cold, calculating look that had been there before. Lila didn't know how to react, how to feel. "Can I sit?" Ramirez asked quietly, almost as if she were unsure of what to say next. Lila nodded numbly, though she didn't speak. She had nothing left to say. The detective pulled up a chair across from her, her posture more relaxed now, like she'd seen enough to know that there was no easy way through this. "I wanted to make sure you were okay," Ramirez said, her voice gentle. "I know this has been a lot to process." Lila swallowed hard, her throat tight. She wanted to say something, wanted to scream at the world, but no words came. Nothing could express the mix of anger and sadness swirling inside her. "I don't know how to fix this," Lila finally managed to say, her voice small. How do I move on from this?" Detective Ramirez took a slow breath, her gaze steady. "You don't move on. Not right away. And maybe not ever. But you do find a way to survive it. To make it out alive." Lila looked down, her eyes still filled with tears. But there was something else there now. A faint glimmer of something other than despair. "I thought I had control over my life," she whispered. "But I was so wrong." Ramirez studied her for a long moment before speaking again, her voice more serious now. "Everyone makes mistakes, Lila, even the ones who try to do right. But it's how you choose to move forward that matters now." The words hit Lila harder than she expected. They made something shift inside her. She wasn't sure if it was hope or resignation, but it was something. She had to move forward. She had no choice. No matter how deep the scars, no matter how much she wished to erase the last few months, she had to keep going. She wasn't the killer. She hadn't chosen this, but she could choose her next step. "Do you think I'll ever get out of this?" Lila asked, her voice hoarse, eyes searching the detective's face. Ramirez gave a small, knowing nod. "The truth is your path out of here, Lila. The facts are all in place now. The evidence we found, it clears you. But it's a hard road, and it'll be long." Lila took a shaky breath. A part of her wanted to collapse right there, to let the grief and fear overwhelm her. But another part, the stronger part, refused to break completely. She wouldn't let the man who destroyed her life win. She would find a way to rebuild. "Thank you," Lila whispered, though the words felt inadequate. Ramirez nodded, offering a faint smile. "Just remember, it's okay to not have all the answers right now. But you will." The detective stood, heading toward the door. Lila remained seated, her eyes focused on nothing in particular. As the door closed behind Ramirez, Lila finally allowed herself to exhale fully, her shoulders sinking with the weight of everything. There was no going back. But there was one thing left: survival. And in that moment, that was all Lila could hold on to. Lila sat there in the dim, cold room, the silence pressing down on her chest. It felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in, trying to trap her in this moment forever. But the truth was, she couldn't stay in this room. Not physically and certainly not emotionally. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, the tears still fresh. But there was a flicker of determination starting to stir in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't over. Not yet. She wasn't sure what the next step was, or how she would find the strength to face the world outside these walls. But she knew one thing. She couldn't let herself be consumed by the pain. The past weeks, months even, had been nothing but a whirlwind of lies, manipulation, and deceit. But the truth was out now. The man who had pulled her into his web, the man who had killed his wife to keep his dark secret, was behind bars. He would pay for what he had done. And Lila, no matter how broken she felt, was free from him. For now, anyway. The soft hum of the overhead lights was the only sound in the room. She stood slowly, her legs still shaky, but the movement felt good, felt like something she could control. It was small, but it was a start. She could make it out of here. She had to. Lila moved toward the door, pushing it open. The hallway beyond was quiet, the air cool and sterile. She wasn't sure where she was going, but it didn't matter. One foot in front of the other. That's how it had to be. As she made her way down the hallway, the door to the interrogation room shutting softly behind her, she caught a glimpse of herself in a mirror. Her reflection was pale, hollow-eyed, and bruised from the weight of everything she had gone through. But there was still a spark in her eyes. It was faint, but it was there. Lila. She turned at the sound of her name, and there stood Detective Ramirez, watching her from the end of the hallway. "Are you okay?" Ramirez asked, her voice softer than before. Lila wasn't sure if she could truly say she was okay, but she wasn't going to break. Not here. Not now. "I'm alive," Lila said, her voice steady, though her heart was still unsteady. "That's all I can say." Ramirez nodded. "You're stronger than you think." The detective's words felt like a lifeline, but Lila didn't know if she could fully believe them. Not yet. "Do you want to talk about it?" Ramirez asked, her tone suggesting that she was offering more than just a conversation. Lila shook her head. "Not yet. I don't even know what to say anymore." Ramirez didn't press. She just gave a small nod, acknowledging Lila's need for space. "When you're ready, the door's open." Lila nodded, but she wasn't sure if she would take that offer. Not yet. With one final glance at the detective, Lila turned and continued down the hallway. The exit was ahead. The sunlight outside would feel like a different world, one that had been darkened by the storm that had passed through her life. But the world was still out there, and she had to face it. One step at a time, and though she didn't have all the answers, she knew something now. She wasn't going to let this destroy her. She wasn't going to let him win. The rest of her life, the pieces of it, might be scattered and broken, but it was still hers to rebuild. And so, with one final breath, Lila stepped into the unknown, not as a victim, but as a survivor. For the first time in months, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could make it through this. Lila stepped into the blinding daylight. The sun warmer than she expected after the cold, sterile atmosphere of the interrogation room. It felt almost surreal, as if the world outside was still unaware of the storm that had just unfolded in her life. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the city, the faint mix of sand, exhaust, and the distant sound of traffic. Dubai, the place she had once dreamed of living in, had now become a prison in her mind. But it was still the world she knew, and the world she had to face now. As she walked down the steps of the police building, her footsteps echoed in the empty street. The weight of everything, her tangled emotions, the dark memories, the questions that had no answers, clung to her like a second skin. She wasn't sure where she was going, but she couldn't go home, not yet. The thought of stepping into the apartment she had shared with him, the man who had turned everything she thought she knew upside down, made her stomach churn. The memories would never leave her. She didn't want to face the ghost of him in every corner of that place. The streets of Dubai felt foreign now. The towering buildings, the sparkling lights, all of it seemed so distant, so irrelevant. She felt small, insignificant, as if she were walking through a world that didn't care. She stopped at a nearby bench, her legs giving way as she sank onto the seat. She wrapped her arms around herself, her head dropping into her hands. The weight of the past few days hit her all at once, the exhaustion finally catching up to her. Why had she trusted him? The question kept spiraling, taunting her with every turn. She thought they had something real. She had convinced herself that he was her escape, that together they could build something better, something that wasn't bound by the limits of her past. But now, she could see the truth. It had all been a lie, and even worse, it was a lie that had cost a life. His wife. Lila clenched her fists, feeling a deep pang of guilt. She wasn't the killer, but she had been a part of it. She had been caught in his web, and now a woman, an innocent woman, was dead because of him. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. She pulled it out, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw the name on the screen. It was him, the man who had betrayed her, the man who had shattered her world. Her hand trembled as she stared at the phone, the message blinking in her notifications. Asterisk, I'm sorry, Lila. I never meant for it to go this far. Please talk to me, asterisk. She wanted to throw the phone away, wanted to erase every last trace of him from her life. But something kept her from pressing the button. A small, twisted part of her still wanted answers. Why? She wanted to ask him, wanted to scream at him for everything he had done. But would it even matter? Would it change anything? Lila's thumb hovered over the screen, but she couldn't bring herself to reply. There was no more forgiveness left in her. No more excuses for the man who had played her, used her, and murdered his wife to keep his secrets safe. The phone buzzed again, and this time, Lila shoved it back into her pocket. She had to keep moving, had to get out of this place, away from everything that reminded her of him. But where could she go? She didn't know. All she knew was that she couldn't stay still. Not now. Lila stood up from the bench, her legs weak but determined. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. She had no choice but to face the world head-on, no matter how broken it felt. A car passed by, its engine roaring as it sped down the street. Lila watched it disappear into the distance. Her heart was heavy, but there was something else there now too, a flicker of hope. For the first time since everything had shattered, she realized something. She was free. The world was waiting, full of possibilities she hadn't even considered. Her past didn't define her. What mattered was the future. And though she wasn't sure what it would look like, she knew one thing for certain. She would find a way to rebuild. Lila turned her back on the past and took the first step into the unknown. Lila walked down the street, her footsteps steady, but her mind in turmoil. Each step felt like a declaration of independence, though it was hard to shake the feeling that she was leaving parts of herself behind. The air felt different, cooler than it had before, as though it was filled with possibility, yet tinged with a certain bitterness. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the city. Everything felt both familiar and foreign at once. She didn't know where she was going. Her eyes scanned the city around her, taking in the glittering skyscrapers, the hurried pedestrians, the soft hum of life, continuing as it always had. The world hadn't stopped for her. She wasn't sure if that was a relief or a reminder of how alone she felt. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the lies, the murder, was still pressing against her chest. But as she walked, a small, quiet voice inside her started to grow. She was alive. She was still here. And somehow, that meant something. As the streets became busier, Lila turned a corner and found herself near the water, one of the calmer parts of the city. The gentle waves lapping against the shore seemed almost peaceful in contrast to the chaos swirling in her mind. She took a seat on one of the benches near the water, the sounds of the city fading into the background as she focused on the cool breeze ruffling her hair. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from the momentary calm. She glanced down, seeing another message from him. Asterisk, please. I'm begging you. We can still figure this out. I need you, asterisk. Lila's heart clenched, but she didn't reach for the phone this time. The words felt hollow, empty, as though he were trying to hold on to something that had already been lost. And maybe in some twisted way, she had wanted to believe him. But she couldn't anymore. The realization settled in her chest like a weight she hadn't known she was carrying. She had been a part of something monstrous, something that had almost destroyed her. She had trusted him, believed his lies, and that had led to a woman's death. A woman who never deserved it. I can't save you, Lila thought to herself. I can't save anyone but me. She turned her face toward the setting sun, letting the orange and pink hues of the sky fill her vision, trying to push out the dark thoughts, trying to ground herself in something, anything, that wasn't a reminder of the nightmare she had just escaped. She knew the next steps wouldn't be easy. There would be legal battles, there would be whispers behind her back, and there would be questions. The truth would be out there, but she wasn't sure what people would think of her. Would they see her as a victim? Or just another woman caught up in something she never understood? But none of that mattered right now. Right now, she was here, and she had survived. The waves crashed softly against the shore as the sun disappeared below the horizon, leaving behind a deep, soft twilight. And in the quiet of that moment, Lila realized something that felt both foreign and freeing. She could choose her path from here. She could rebuild her life, piece by piece. The fear of the future still gripped her heart. But there was something else there too. A flicker of hope. She had walked through the darkest part of the storm and made it out alive. And somehow, that made her believe she could make it through whatever came next. With one last glance at the horizon, Lila stood up from the bench, wiping away the tears that had quietly fallen down her face. She had no idea where she was going, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't need to know. She just needed to keep moving forward. Lila stepped away from the water, the soft sand shifting beneath her shoes. The cool breeze tugged at her hair, and for a moment, she felt like she could just keep walking forever, away from everything, away from the memories that had kept her trapped. But she knew she couldn't. The world would keep spinning, and whether she was ready or not, it was time for her to move. Time for her to make the decision to leave the past behind. The streets of Dubai, with their bright lights and towering skyscrapers, seemed less intimidating now. The weight of her memories still clung to her. But there was a fire, however small, that burned within her, a spark she hadn't felt in so long. Her phone buzzed again. Another message, another plea. This time, she didn't even look at it. She was done. Done with his lies. Done with the manipulation. Done with the guilt. She was moving on. Lila walked down the street, her steps more confident now, her heart steadying with each passing moment. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she had a choice. She could go back to the apartment she had shared with him. She could sit in the darkness and let the past consume her. But she didn't have to. She could take control. She could make a new life for herself, one that wasn't defined by his actions, by the death that had hovered over her like a shadow. As she turned another corner, her phone buzzed again, this time with a call. Lila hesitated. She knew who it was. Her hand hovered over the phone, but after a long, quiet breath, she pressed the button to reject the call. The sound of it ending was oddly satisfying, like closing a door on a chapter she had long ago outgrown. Her heart was pounding, and her palms were clammy, but she didn't feel afraid anymore, not like she used to, not like she had felt trapped in his grasp, in the web of lies and danger. She was free now, and it felt terrifying, but it also felt like the only thing she had left. As she kept walking, she thought about the life she could build. It wouldn't be easy. She would have to find new routes, new connections, and maybe even a new version of herself. But the one thing that was clear was that she wasn't the same person who had walked into that nightmare months ago. She was stronger. Lila didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stop now. Every step forward was a defiance against the past, against the man who had tried to control her life. Every step was a declaration of her own survival. She found herself near the marina, the bright lights of the yachts reflecting off the water, a symbol of the wealth and power that Dubai flaunted so openly. But tonight, it wasn't just the luxury that caught her attention. It was the serenity of the sea, the endless horizon. For the first time, Lila allowed herself to imagine what could be. She could leave Dubai. She could find a place where no one knew her story, no one knew what she had been through. She could start fresh, somewhere else, somewhere far away from the people and places that had held her prisoner. The thought of leaving it all behind almost scared her, but the idea of staying was worse. She was standing at the edge of the water now, the quiet hum of the city still buzzing in the distance. The waves lapped gently at the shore, the cool water shimmering in the moonlight. Lila pulled out her phone one last time. There was no call this time. She wasn't checking for messages. She was looking at the world map, her finger tracing across the places she could go. She had the world at her fingertips. She didn't know where she would land. Maybe it would be a small town, maybe it would be another bustling city. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she was choosing it for herself. The phone buzzed again. Another message. Another desperate plea from him. Lila didn't even read it this time. She deleted it without hesitation, her fingers swiping across the screen like it was nothing more than a bad dream. Her past was just that, the past. And now, the future was hers. With a deep breath, Lila stood taller, letting the night air fill her lungs. One step at a time, one decision at a time. She was ready. Lila stood there, the weight of the night lifting off her shoulders with every deep breath she took. The moon above cast a soft glow over the water, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to simply be. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She was free. The thought settled over her like a blanket, warm and comforting. There was no going back to what she'd been before, and that was okay. In fact, it was more than okay, it was necessary. The person she'd been, the life she had been living, had been built on lies, on a foundation of darkness that she had almost let swallow her whole. But not anymore. Lila turned away from the water, the soft sand still clinging to her shoes as she made her way down the path. She didn't look back, didn't even try to, because in that moment she knew she had left behind what no longer served her. The world felt vast and uncertain ahead of her, but for the first time, it didn't scare her. It felt alive, full of possibility. She didn't have a plan, not really, but for the first time, that didn't matter. She had the freedom to choose, to move, to grow. That was the only thing she needed to hold on to now. As she walked through the streets, the city around her felt like a stranger. A city she had once felt connected to, but had now outgrown. Dubai was no longer the dream she had once envisioned. It was a chapter that had ended, its pages stained with the lies of a man who had manipulated her heart and mind. The night air was cool, the city lights flickering like distant stars. She could hear the laughter of a group of people as they passed by, the sounds of life carrying on without her. And for the first time, she felt detached from it all. She wasn't part of their world anymore, but that was okay. Lila found herself outside a small cafe, its warm lights spilling out into the street. The sign above read open, and for a moment she paused, considering. She wasn't hungry, but the warmth inside felt inviting. Maybe it would be good to sit for a moment, gather her thoughts, make sense of everything. She pushed open the door, the bell above it ringing softly as she stepped inside. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and pastries, and for a second she was reminded of simpler times, before the chaos, before the darkness. She found an empty table in the corner and sat down, the world still spinning in her mind, but the stillness around her grounding her. The barista behind the counter gave her a nod, and she offered a faint smile in return. It was an automatic gesture, but it felt like a step toward reclaiming herself. The cafe was quiet, save for the soft murmur of conversation and the clinking of mugs. She pulled her phone out again, but this time it wasn't to check messages or calls. It was to look at the map one more time, to imagine the possibilities for her future. She needed to make a decision. Her finger hovered over the screen for a moment, the world map before her. There were places far beyond Dubai she could go. Cities where no one would know her name, where the past couldn't catch up to her. Do I stay here, she asked herself, or do I start over somewhere new? She didn't have an answer, not yet. But in this moment, it didn't feel as urgent. The answers would come when they were ready, and Lila was ready to wait for them. She wasn't rushing anymore. She had time. She had a future. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she didn't hesitate. She clicked it open, the familiar name flashing on the screen. The message was short, but sent a chill down her spine. Asterisk, I know what you're doing. You can't run from me forever, asterisk. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Her finger hovered over the message, her chest tightening as anger and fear bubbled up inside her. How does he still have power over me? But this time, she didn't respond. The feeling was familiar, the sensation of being hunted, of being controlled. But Lila knew something now. She didn't have to answer. She didn't have to live in fear. For the first time, she realized she had a choice. She had the power to decide her fate. She set the phone down, her hands shaking. But there was something else inside her now. A spark of defiance. She was done. Done with fear. Done with being manipulated. Done with being tied to the past. The message had no power over her. She wouldn't let it. Lila took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling slowly. She was still figuring things out, still finding her way, but she knew one thing for sure. The world wasn't as scary as it seemed. She wasn't as alone as she had once thought. She had the power to build something new, something for herself. She looked out the window at the night sky, the city lights twinkling like stars, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. Tomorrow would be another day, another chance to keep moving forward. And Lila was ready for it. The night was growing quieter as Lila sat at the cafe, the comforting hum of the world outside, creating a soft backdrop to her thoughts. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't waiting for something to happen. She wasn't looking over her shoulder, fearing that someone would come for her, or that the past would rise up and drag her back into its suffocating grip. She was just being. Her fingers drummed lightly on the table, a rhythm she hadn't noticed until now. The coffee she had ordered was lukewarm, forgotten, but the stillness around her felt more refreshing than anything else. It wasn't that everything was suddenly perfect. Far from it. The shadows of the past clung to her like a second skin, and she wasn't naive enough to think they would vanish overnight. But now, in this small, quiet moment, she realized that she had taken the first step in reclaiming her life. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about choosing what came next. Lila stared out the window again, watching as the people walked by, oblivious to the storm that had just passed through her life. For a brief moment, she felt disconnected from everything, as if she were watching from a distance, a spectator in a world she no longer quite fit into. But then something shifted. She didn't want to be a spectator anymore. A part of her had thought that moving on meant forgetting, but it wasn't. It wasn't about erasing the chapters she had lived through. It was about accepting them, learning from them, and moving forward despite the scars. She had endured. She had survived. And now it was time to take back what had been lost. The door of the cafe opened, the chime ringing above as a new wave of customers stepped in. Lila's gaze flicked toward them, but her mind was elsewhere, her thoughts drifting back to the message she had just read. Asterisk, I know what you're doing. You can't run from me forever, asterisk. The words made her skin prickle, but they didn't have the same hold on her they once did. The fear she had once felt in the pit of her stomach was quieter now, fainter. It was still there lingering, but she wasn't running from it anymore. She wasn't going to let the past define her. Let him try, she thought, the resolve in her chest growing firmer with each passing second. He'll never break me again. Her phone buzzed once more, the screen lighting up with another message. Her heart skipped a beat, but this time she didn't hesitate. She didn't have to look. Instead, she powered off her phone. The small action felt like an anchor, grounding her in the reality she was beginning to build. The world felt heavy, but it was hers to carry now. She wasn't weighed down by his lies, by his darkness. She had walked out of that, and no matter how hard he tried, she was never going back. She was done living in fear. Lila took a deep breath and stood up, her legs slightly unsteady, but strong enough to hold her. As she walked toward the door, the warmth of the cafe receded behind her, but the strength inside her only grew. There was a whole world out there waiting for her, and she had every right to take it on, piece by piece. She stepped out into the street, the cool night air filling her lungs. The city around her was vast, full of stories and lives and possibilities, and for the first time, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt open. This is just the beginning, she thought, her heart beating a little faster as she turned down the road. She didn't know where she was going yet, but she was going, one foot in front of the other. Step by step, she was moving forward. The streets felt different now. The hum of the city, the distant chatter of people, the soft sounds of traffic, everything had a new rhythm to it. Lila's footsteps were steady, purposeful, as though the very act of walking was an assertion of her strength, a defiance against everything she had left behind. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the weight that had once anchored her down felt a little lighter with every step she took. It wasn't just the city that felt different. It was her. She was no longer a passenger in her own life. She was taking control. The night air, cool and crisp, brushed against her skin as she walked deeper into the city. The lights of Dubai were dazzling, casting long shadows across the streets. The city's heartbeat was constant, never pausing, never resting, and in that rhythm, Lila found a strange kind of comfort. It was a reminder that life didn't stop. It couldn't. No matter what had happened, the world was always turning, always moving forward. Lila paused at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. She glanced around, her eyes catching the flash of neon signs, the gleam of sleek cars speeding past. She had always been drawn to the shine, to the glamour of the city, but now it all felt empty. The lights, the opulence, none of it had meaning anymore, not without real purpose behind it. And that purpose, it was hers to find. The light turned, and she crossed the street, her pace quickening. There's something urgent now, a feeling that she couldn't explain, but that she knew she had to follow. The world was wide open, and she was no longer bound to anyone's expectations but her own. A few blocks ahead, she saw a small hotel. The neon sign above its door flickered weakly in the night, but to Lila, it looked like an anchor, a place to stop, even if just for a moment, and regroup. She walked up to the entrance, pausing for a brief second. Inside, a few people lingered near the lobby, their low murmurs filling the quiet space. The receptionist looked up as she entered, offering a polite smile. Lila approached the desk, the warmth of the building a stark contrast to the cool air outside. "How can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her voice soft but professional. Lila swallowed, hesitating for just a moment before she spoke. "I need a room. Just for the night." The woman nodded, her fingers quickly typing into the computer. "Of course. Just a moment." Lila could feel the tension in her shoulders easing as the seconds ticked by. It was a small decision, but one that felt like it mattered. It was hers. It was her choice to take this pause, this breath, before moving forward again. The receptionist handed her a key. "Room 212. Here you go. Have a pleasant stay." Lila took the key, a quiet thank you escaping her lips. She turned and headed toward the elevators, the hum of the building almost a lullaby in the background. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and she stepped inside, her hand resting on the cool metal railing as it slowly ascended. When the doors opened again on the second floor, Lila walked down the narrow hall, the muted light casting soft pools of shadow at her feet. She reached room 212 and slid the keycard into the lock. The door clicked open. She stepped inside. The room was small but clean, the simple furnishings a relief from the noise and chaos of the city. There was a bed, a desk, and a small bathroom. Everything felt still, almost quiet, as though it were waiting for her to breathe. Lila set her bag down on the desk, her eyes scanning the room. There were no reminders of anyone else, no traces of a life she had been forced to leave behind. This was her space now. She sat down on the bed, her back against the headboard, and took a deep breath. The past few days, the weight of everything she had learned, still pressed against her chest, but it felt manageable now. She had made it this far, after all, and even if she wasn't sure of her next step, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't going to let fear rule her life anymore. Lila pulled her phone out of her bag, the screen still dark. She stared at it for a moment, the weight of it in her hands. It would keep trying. She knew that, but she had learned something in the last few hours. The control he once had over her was gone. He couldn't reach her anymore, and she wasn't going back. She powered the phone off, her finger lingering on the button as it powered down. The soft hum of the device dying in her hands felt final, like a chapter closing with a quiet click. Lila turned her attention back to the room, the silence now enveloping her. Outside, the city continued its dance of light and motion, but here, in this moment, it was just her. And for the first time, that was enough. Tomorrow would come, and she would face it. But tonight, she allowed herself a small sense of peace, a moment to simply rest, to let the world outside blur into the background. She lay back on the bed, closing her eyes, letting the quiet of the room wash over her. There was no need to rush. Her life was hers to rebuild. And for the first time, she felt like she might just be ready. The stillness of the room wrapped around her like a cocoon, and for a long moment, Lila did nothing but lie there, eyes closed, breathing slowly. Her thoughts, once scattered and frantic, began to settle. The weight of her decision, of choosing her own path, no longer felt like a burden. It felt like freedom. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, or the day after that, but it was hers to face. She would rebuild her life from the ground up, piece by piece, and though the future was uncertain, she wasn't afraid of it anymore. A soft knock on the door snapped her from her thoughts, and her heart gave a sharp jolt of alarm. She wasn't expecting anyone. Lila hesitated, her breath catching for a moment. It could be anything: room service, a mistake, maybe someone else needing something. But she wasn't sure. Her hand rested near the phone she had just powered off, and for a moment, she wondered if it was him. No, she thought, pushing the fear aside. No one can touch me now. Another knock, louder this time, and her pulse quickened. She stood slowly, moving cautiously toward the door, her feet light against the floorboards. As she approached, she looked through the peephole. A figure stood outside, but she couldn't make out the face clearly. The shadow was tall, broad-shouldered, and a sense of unease crept through her veins. Her hand hovered over the door handle. Should she open it? Should she call for help? Another knock, more urgent now, and the voice that followed made her blood run cold. "Lila," it said, low and familiar, sending a shiver down her spine. "I know you're in there. We need to talk." Her stomach flipped. It was him. Her first instinct was to bolt, to run. But the adrenaline surged through her, and her fingers wrapped tightly around the handle, pulling it open just a crack. Outside stood a man she had tried so hard to forget. His face was just as she remembered. Sharp jaw, dark eyes that held the weight of too many secrets. He was dressed casually, yet there was something unsettling about him, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "Go away," Lila said, her voice shaking slightly, though she didn't want to show it. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing how badly he still terrified her. He stepped forward, his presence filling the narrow space between them. "You think you can just run from everything, Lila?" he asked softly, his tone almost like a whisper, yet laced with something darker. "You think you're free?" The words sent a chill down her spine, and she forced herself to stand firm, her back straight. "He's not in control anymore," she reminded herself. "I don't owe you anything," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Leave me alone." His smile was tight, his eyes narrowing with something cold and calculating. "You can't outrun the past, Lila. Not forever." Her heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to back down. "I'm not the same person you knew. You don't get to dictate my life anymore." There was a tense silence as their gazes locked, a silent battle of wills. The city outside seemed to disappear, the world narrowing down to just the two of them in that hallway, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. He stepped back slowly, his lips curling into a smirk. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Lila watched him turn and walk away, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. She didn't close the door immediately. Instead, she stood there for a moment, heart still racing, her breath shallow. She had stood her ground, but the fear still clung to her like a shadow, the lingering threat of him ever present. When she finally closed the door, the sound of the lock clicking into place was oddly reassuring. But it didn't calm her completely. Her phone, still powered off, sat on the desk, and she thought for a moment about turning it back on. But then she remembered what he'd said. Asterisk will see about that asterisk. Was he threatening her? Had he come here to intimidate her? No, she couldn't let him have that power over her anymore. Lila sat back on the bed, her legs shaking, but her resolve growing firmer with each passing second. This wasn't over, she knew that, but it wasn't the end either. She had taken the first step toward her freedom, and now there was no going back. She would have to be smarter, stronger. She couldn't just run from her past, but she could face it, and she could survive it. She wasn't sure how or when, or what the next move was. But one thing was clear. She wouldn't let him win. Not this time. Not ever again. And with that thought, she closed her eyes, trying to push the anxiety aside, and allowed herself a few moments of rest. The night was still young, and tomorrow, the fight would continue. But for now, she had survived the first challenge. And that was enough. Lila woke the next morning to the harsh sunlight streaming through the curtains. The city was already awake, its sounds filtering into the room. A constant hum of life moving forward, as if nothing had happened, as if the night before had been nothing more than a bad dream. She blinked against the brightness, her thoughts racing. The encounter with him was still fresh in her mind, his cold eyes, his words. Asterisk, you can't outrun the past star. It felt like a warning, a reminder that no matter how far she went, he would always find her. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, but for the first time, she didn't feel trapped. She felt something else, Asterisk, determined star. She threw the covers off and sat up, her body still heavy with the remnants of sleep and fear. But there was a flicker of something more, a resolve. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to let him pull her back into his web. The past few months had been full of chaos, of lies and threats and manipulation, but now she had the power to choose, to decide who she was and who she wanted to become. Lila grabbed her phone from the desk and powered it on. The screen lit up, revealing the dozens of missed calls and unread messages. Her heart skipped when she saw his name at the top of the list. She took a steadying breath, but she didn't immediately open the message. Instead, she swiped the screen down, dismissing the notifications one by one. She wasn't going to let him control her through fear. Not anymore. She stood up, her legs still shaky but her mind clear. The city outside beckoned her, full of possibility, full of life. She didn't know exactly what her next step was, but she knew she couldn't keep hiding in the shadows of her past. The room around her felt suddenly small, as though it had served its purpose. Lila grabbed her things, stuffing them into her bag without a second thought. She needed to leave. The cafe down the street seemed like a good place to think, to clear her mind, to plan. As she stepped outside, the sun was warm on her face, the air thick with the promise of a new day. The city, her city, pulsed around her, full of opportunities and choices she hadn't even begun to explore. Her past would always be there, lurking in the corners of her mind. But she had a future now, and she wasn't going to waste it, not on fear, not on someone who didn't deserve a second thought. Lila took a deep breath, her chest filling with the scent of the city. Today, she was walking away from the past, and there was no turning back. Lila walked down the street, the morning sunlight now soft and golden against the buildings. It was a new day. The weight of the past was still there, but it was lighter. She had left it behind, piece by piece, until it no longer held power over her. With every step, she felt stronger, more certain. She didn't have all the answers yet, didn't know what her future would hold, but that uncertainty didn't scare her anymore. It felt like freedom, the freedom to shape her life, to choose what came next. As she reached the small cafe she had spotted earlier, she paused at the entrance, letting the sounds of the city wash over her. People were chatting, cars passing by, the world bustling around her. But here, in this moment, she was no longer a part of that chaos. She had stepped outside of it, and for the first time, it felt like she had control. She walked inside, the door chime ringing softly as she did. The barista behind the counter smiled at her, a warm, genuine greeting that felt like the start of something new. Lila returned the smile, a quiet affirmation that she was, indeed, moving forward. She ordered a coffee, a simple comfort, and took a seat by the window, watching the world go by. The cafe was cozy, peaceful, a stark contrast to the whirlwind her life had been only weeks ago. She sipped her coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her. There were no more messages to check, no more doors to hide behind. She had stepped out of the shadows, and the sun felt brighter now. Lila looked out at the horizon, the city sprawling in front of her, full of endless possibilities. She didn't know what would happen next, but she was okay with that. She had learned something important. It wasn't the destination that mattered. It was the journey. And now, for the first time in a long time, she was ready for whatever came next. The past was behind her. The future was hers. And that was enough.